40 countries, one decision, and America wasn't invited to the table. That sentence alone should stop you cold. Because what happened in the last few weeks isn't a trade dispute, it isn't a tariff negotiation, and it isn't a diplomatic misunderstanding. It is something far larger, far more deliberate, and far more dangerous for the economic order that has existed since 1945. A coalition of nations representing nearly $45 trillion in combined economic output quietly began formalizing a framework to reduce their dependence on American markets, American dollars, and American financial infrastructure. Not in theory, in practice, with signed agreements, redirected supply chains, and currency swap arrangements already being activated. And Washington is only now beginning to understand the size of what it is looking at, to understand why this matters. At a scale most people are not grasping yet. You have to go back to something simple. The United States dollar is not just a currency. It is the connective tissue of global trade. When a Brazilian company buys copper from Chile, the transaction clears in dollars. When a Japanese automaker pays a Korean supplier, the settlement goes through dollar-denominated systems. When an African government borrows money to build infrastructure, the debt is almost always priced in dollars. That architecture gives the United States a power that no military budget alone could buy. It means that American sanctions work. It means that American interest rate decisions ripple into every corner of the world. It means that being cut off from dollar systems is, for most countries, an existential threat. That leverage is now being directly challenged, not by one rival, by 40 of them moving together. The number 45 trillion sounds abstract until you place it next to something real. The entire United States GDP is approximately $28 trillion. The coalition being assembled now represents an economy that is larger than America itself, and the explicit stated goal of this framework is to build trade, settlement, and financing infrastructure that does not require American participation, American approval, or American currency. That is not a competitor emerging from the fringes. That is a parallel system being constructed by economies that collectively outweigh the one they're trying to rote around. The immediate trigger was Trump's tariff escalation. The administration moved aggressively, hitting imports from dozens of nations simultaneously, raising rates to levels not seen since the 1930s on certain categories, and making clear that the era of relatively open American market access was over. The calculation in Washington was familiar. America is the largest consumer market on earth. Countries need access to American buyers more than America needs their goods, and therefore tariff pressure creates negotiating leverage. That calculation had one flaw. It assumed the alternative to accepting American terms was nothing. It assumed that the only option for countries being squeezed was to absorb the damage and come back to the table. But 40 governments looked at that assumption and decided it was wrong. They decided that the alternative to American market access was each other. Here is where the numbers become visceral. The countries moving toward this new framework include major exporters across Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, Africa, and Europe. Combined, they represent export volumes that dwarf what they send to the United States. For most of them, America represents somewhere between 10 and 18% of their total export market. That is significant, but it is not existential. What the new framework offers is structured access to a collective market of over 4 billion people. The math changes completely when you run those numbers. Honestly, think about it this way. Imagine you have a regular customer who buys about 15% of everything you produce. One day, that customer tells you the price he is willing to pay. is going down 25%, and if you complain, he will buy even less. Meanwhile, your other customers, who together buy the other 85%, come to you and say, "We will formalize our relationship, give you guaranteed contracts, help you finance your expansion, and settle everything in a currency that none of us controls exclusively." What do? You do not abandon your difficult customer overnight, but you start building the infrastructure to need him less. That is exactly what is happening right now, and it is happening faster than most analysts expected. What do you think? Can the United States actually afford to lose access to 40 major export partners at the same time? Write your answer in the comments. The trade redirection is only the visible surface. Underneath it, the architecture being built is financial. And that is where this story becomes genuinely dangerous, not just for American influence, but for anyone holding significant dollar-denominated assets. The participating countries are accelerating the development of bilateral currency swap arrangements. Instead of converting to dollars to settle a trade between, say, Indonesia and Saudi Arabia, the two countries settle directly in their own currencies through prearranged swap lines. The dollar transaction simply does not happen. The clearinghouse that used to sit in New York is bypassed entirely. This sounds technical, but the consequence is enormous. Every dollar transaction that does not occur is one less piece of demand for the dollar itself. And dollar demand is not just about trade. It is what supports the entire structure of American borrowing, American deficit spending, and American financial dominance. For context, the United States currently carries a national debt approaching $37 trillion. It services that debt because the world needs dollars, buys dollar assets, and accepts dollar-denominated instruments as the baseline of financial safety. If the structural demand for dollars begins to erode, that servicing cost rises. Interest rates on American debt go up, not because the Federal Reserve chooses it, but because the market for American debt is getting smaller. That is a spiral that has no clean exit, and the countries building this new framework know exactly what they are doing. The $45 trillion figure represents the combined nominal GDP of the coalition. But the more important number is what happens to that figure over the next decade. The International Monetary Fund's most recent projections show that the economies participating in this realignment are growing at an average rate roughly twice that of the United States. If the current trajectory holds, the economic weight of this bloc relative to America will be significantly larger in 10 years than it is today. The window for the United States to reverse this through pressure is closing, not because of hostility, because of arithmetic. Now, let us talk about what this means for exports specifically, because the headline of 40 countries cutting exports to America deserves a precise explanation. The cuts are not uniform, and they're not all government-mandated. Some are tariff responses, matching American levies with their own. Some are regulatory shifts, introducing new compliance standards that make American goods less competitive. Some are procurement policy changes, where government contracts that previously went to American companies are being redirected to coalition partners, and some are simply market forces. As the new trade framework offers better terms within the bloc, the commercial logic of exporting to America weakens on its own. The sectors where this is most visible are instructive. Agricultural exports from South America and Southeast Asia to the United States are being redirected to growing middle-class markets within the coalition. Technology components that flow through complex global supply chains are being rerouted to reduce the number of steps that touch American soil American companies or American financial systems. Energy contracts that were previously priced in dollars are being repriced in alternative currencies under bilateral deals. None of these changes makes tomorrow's news headline. Each one is a brick being removed from a foundation that took 80 years to build. The Trump administration's response has been a combination of escalation and attempted bilateral deals. The logic is to pick off individual members of the coalition, offer them better bilateral terms, and fragment the bloc before it solidifies. This strategy has worked in some historical cases. It is facing an unusual obstacle this time. The countries in this framework have explicitly built their coordination around not being fragmented. They have built-in mechanisms where a bilateral deal with America that undercuts the coalition framework triggers penalties and loss of access within the bloc. The architecture was designed specifically to resist the divide and conquer approach. Whoever designed it understood American diplomatic strategy well. Now, where are you watching this video from right now? Drop your country in the comments below. Washington's internal debates are now fractured. One camp argues for doubling down on tariffs and sanctions, believing that American financial and consumer market power is still sufficient to force compliance. A second camp is pushing for a negotiated de-escalation, arguing that the coalition is more dangerous than the tariff revenue is worth. A third camp, growing louder in recent weeks, is arguing that the real threat is not the trade framework itself, but what it will do to dollar demand. And that this requires a response at the monetary and financial level, not just the trade level. The problem is that all three of these camps are responding to something that has already been set in motion. The $45 trillion framework did not form last week. The conversations, the swap line negotiations, the procurement redirections, the currency arrangements, these have been building for several years. The tariff escalation of the Trump era accelerated them, but it did not create them. The decision by dozens of countries to reduce structural dependence on American systems was already underway. What changed is the pace and the public visibility. This is where the parallel to the derivative situation becomes sharp. In the financial world, there is a concept called hidden leverage, risk that exists in the system but does not appear on the surfaces that regulators and investors look at daily. The $845 trillion derivatives market is an example of financial hidden leverage. What is happening geopolitically now is a form of structural hidden leverage, a rebalancing of global economic power that does not show up cleanly in any single data point, any single news event, or any single market indicator. It accumulates quietly, then it does not. The signal events are already appearing. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has been declining for several years, falling from over 70% 2 decades ago to roughly 58% today. That sounds like a small shift until you understand the speed of the change and the direction of the trajectory. Central banks do not move reserves quickly. The fact that they are moving at all and in one direction consistently is the kind of signal that only becomes obvious after the moment when it was still actionable has passed. American companies operating internationally are already feeling the friction. Supply chains built around American hub logistics and dollar settlement are becoming more expensive to run as the alternative infrastructure improves. Not impossible, not catastrophic yet, but more expensive. And in a competitive global economy, more expensive is the same as less competitive. Slowly, then suddenly, the countries leading this coalition are not doing so out of ideology. They're doing it out of financial calculation. For most of them, the dollar system has been a source of vulnerability as much as it has been a source of stability. When the Federal Reserve raises interest rates to control American inflation, capital flows out of emerging markets around the world. Their currencies weaken, their dollar-denominated debt becomes more expensive to service, and their populations pay the price for a decision made in Washington with domestic American politics as the primary consideration. The new framework offers something that the dollar system never did: monetary sovereignty, the ability to set your own financial conditions without having your economic fate determined by American monetary policy. That is an extraordinarily powerful offer. And 40 governments have decided it is worth the short-term cost of reducing American market exposure to get there. Do you believe that the US dollar will lose its status as the world's reserve currency within the next 10 years? Tell us what you think in the comments. For ordinary people sitting outside these geopolitical calculations, the question that matters is the most direct one. What does this mean for me? And the answer depends entirely on where you sit. If you are an American worker in an industry that exports to any of the 40 countries now building alternative frameworks, your market is shrinking, not because your product got worse, because the infrastructure through which you used to sell it is being dismantled piece by piece and replaced with infrastructure that routes around you. The agricultural sector is already seeing this. The technology sector is already seeing this. The financial services sector, which profits enormously from dollar settlement dominance, will see it next and at a larger scale. If you are a saver anywhere in the world holding predominantly dollar-denominated assets, the question is not whether dollar dominance will end, but at what speed and in what sequence. The $45 trillion coalition does not need to destroy the dollar to achieve its goals. It only needs to reduce the dollar's structural necessity enough to weaken the foundation of American fiscal and monetary power. That is a much lower bar than collapse, and it is a bar that is being approached from multiple directions simultaneously. The people who designed this framework understood something that most public commentary still misses. Power in the modern global economy is not primarily military, it is not primarily diplomatic, it is infrastructural. Whoever controls the rails of settlement, clearing, lending, and reserve holding controls the conditions under which everyone else operates. The dollar system gave the United States those rails for 80 years. The $45 trillion alliance is not trying to fight America. It is building different rails, and once the new rails are built and tested and trusted, the old ones become optional. The administration's panic, visible in leaked internal memos and the frequency of contradictory public statements from different parts of the government, reflects a dawning understanding of this dynamic. The tariff strategy assumed that economic pain would create compliance. Instead, it accelerated a process of structural decoupling that was already underway. The countries being pressured did not fold. They formalized. They moved from informal conversations about reducing dollar dependence to a concrete framework with a name, a structure, and $45 trillion worth of combined economic weight behind it. There is a historical precedent for this kind of shift that almost no one is talking about. In the mid-20th century, the British pound was the world's dominant reserve currency, the British Empire the framework within which global trade was organized, and the City of London the center of global finance. The shift away from that system did not happen in a single crisis. It happened through a series of smaller decisions, redirections, and structural changes that each seemed manageable in isolation. By the time the shift was undeniable, it was irreversible. The actors who moved early built the institutions that shaped the next era. The ones who waited to see which way it would go found themselves operating in a system they had not helped design and did not control. That is the precise moment we're in now. The $45 trillion framework is not the endpoint. It is the beginning of an endpoint. The countries building it are not finished. The swap line network is not complete. The alternative settlement systems are not fully tested. The procurement redirections are not total. There is still time, in principle, for a different American approach to slow or reshape what is forming. But that window is defined in months and a small number of years, not in decades. And every week of escalation, instead of recalibration, is a week in which the new infrastructure gets stronger, more trusted, and harder to reverse. What the 40 countries cutting exports from America are really doing is not primarily a trade action. It is a vote of no confidence in the existing system. It is 40 governments collectively deciding that the predictability, the rules, and the stability that American-led economic order once provided are no longer reliably present. And once that confidence breaks, the historical record is clear. It does not come back through pressure. It only comes back through demonstrated reliability over a long period of time. That is a timeline that operates in decades, not in election cycles. The money, the supply chains, the reserve allocations, the settlement systems, they're all moving. Quietly, technically, without dramatic headlines, in most cases, but moving. The $45 trillion number is not a projection. It is what already exists. The question is not whether this realignment is happening. The question is how complete it will be before Washington fully grasps what it is facing and whether any response will come in time to matter. Write in the comments what you think happens next and subscribe to stay with this story as it develops. We will be watching every move.